Co-sponsoring this afternoon. We've already heard, we have a project going on that Kenny Megan will be speaking about a little bit later at BPC. We know that student loans have dominated the headlines recently. The debt has an old budgeteer up here. It's $1.5 trillion in consumer debt, higher than consumer debt for home mortgages. The evidence suggests, I guess, that student loan debt is not only hurting the borrower's ability, but their abilities to purchase homes, save for retirement, and even raise a family. So there are several existing proposals that seek to mitigate. The Secretary's talked about a few of those. Some focus on providing better information to the borrowers. I think that's a given. Others seek to place stricter limits on the loans themselves. Some advocate canceling, as question was raised about existing debt, and others about implementing free college. The panelists will attempt to go beyond the headlines and explore the policy dimensions of this issue, focusing on ways federal policy can improve the situation for current and future borrowers. Just as a sidebar, people at BPC know this, we're getting new carpet in, and I tend to be an old timer, so I accumulate a lot of paper when I shouldn't, and I'm having to clean out my office so that they can put the carpeting in. And this morning I was going back through some of my paperwork. So this is not a new issue. This is an issue that when I was at CBO, issues in designing a federal program of income contingent student loans. This is 1970 or 1994 going forward. So it's not a new issue that's been around. So I look forward. The first panel here will focus on those designed and better support issues. Moderating the discussion is Catherine Lucas McKay. She's the program manager at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, and she'll introduce the panelists. And thank you very much, panelists, for your participation. Thank you. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you. I am really excited to see this full house here today.
There it is.
There we go. Good. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you. I am really excited to see this full house here today because this is such an important issue. As mentioned, I am a program manager at the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program. For those of you who don't know Aspen, we are a think tank, but one with a rather unique place in the DC policy ecosystem, in that we are really organized around the idea of dialogue and equipping leaders to take action to make the changes that they want to see in the world. We bring together diverse voices and have the conversations that are often difficult to have, or that people simply are having around tables not with each other. We also try to translate research and new policy developments that are coming out of all different sectors, whether that is nonprofits, advocates, academia, or policy proposals and legislation. We also, as I said, do our best to equip leaders with the tools that they need to make the changes that they want to see. And for the Financial Security Program, what that means is developing strategies and identifying opportunities for leaders, whether they are in financial services, the nonprofit sector and advocates, and policymakers, to actually operationalize things that would improve the financial security of millions of US households. So we are here today. My fellow panelists are Julie Margetta Morgan from the Roosevelt Institute, Tiffany Jones from the Education Trust, and Jeff Andrade from the McKeon Group. We are, in true Aspen fashion, a group of diverse voices and perspectives, and we are looking forward to having a conversation that is focused on the needs of the 45 million borrowers who have student loans today. We heard that it is a $1.5 trillion aggregate balance, and more than 90% of that is either owned by or guaranteed by the US government. That makes the Department of Education the largest lender in America, which is kind of shocking given that their mission is to ensure that children and young people have the education that they need to succeed in the world, not to manage a $1.5 trillion portfolio. That $1.5 trillion breaks down into a median loan amount of $19,000. About 75% of people who are enrolling today borrow to fund their education. So while right now only 1 in 4 borrowers, or excuse me, 1 in 4 households has student loans, we expect that number to creep up over time. more than 11% of student loans are in default, which adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars. That is a problem that's difficult to ignore and is one of the issues that really drove in the last 2 years, as our program was researching consumer debt, the broad-based concern that we heard from experts. But as we were talking to consumers through focus groups and relationships with our partners, what we heard was more, it's not just a default problem, it's also a problem of managing this on a day-to-day basis, worrying about being a parent who's managing their student loans, looking towards their kids' education and not sure how they're going to take on more. And beyond that, the idea of seeing their balances just grow over time and how overwhelming and dispiriting that was. So our perspective is that there are real problems in the student loan sector. And the conversation that we're going to have takes that as the founding premise and explores to what degree is this problem a serious and urgent one? For whom is it a serious and urgent problem? And what do those facts tell us about what we should do about it? What are the reforms that are truly necessary for us to take on at this moment in time? So, to get us started, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to take about 2 minutes to tell us about their experience working on student loans throughout their careers and current positions, and also just on a 1 to 5 scale, how urgent would you say that this problem is?
Which is the most urgent?
So just like as a whole, student loans.
Okay.
Because I think that we'll get some pretty different numbers.
Okay. So hi, I'm Julie Margetta Morgan. I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Am I not on? I'm on now. Sorry about that. I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. I've been studying student debt for a long time in a variety of different positions. At Roosevelt, I've done work both on how the student loan industry works, how the servicing of student debt works, but also on the larger picture of the context of the student loan program. The work that I've done, I think, puts our student debt crisis at about a 5, I'd say. I'm assuming that's the highest one. And I think Marshall, my co-author on my most recent paper, I think the work we've done brings some good context to how we got to where we are, which I think helps lead towards solution. So I'll just talk about that a little bit. So just in terms of, I think you went through a little bit of the stakes here, but I just want to emphasize we have higher and higher debt loads, particularly for low and middle income families. A lot of the rhetoric around student debt focuses on the fact that that some debt sits with higher income families, but just to center us, 2/3 of the debt is held by households with incomes of less than $97,000. We have off again, sorry. We have high defaults and delinquencies, and we have starkly racialized outcomes in our student loan system. So Black borrowers are more likely to borrow, they are more likely to see their balances rise rather than fall over time, and they're far more likely to default on their student loans than their white counterparts. So I think just as important is to understand how we got to where we are. So a lot of the rhetoric again, focuses on the college wage premium that people earn more over their lifetime with a college degree. So we hear that, you'll earn $1 million more over your lifetime. Our work takes a look at not just that premium, but what drives it. And so when we look at that, we can see the falling wages for people with a high school diploma. So instead of saying college is a great opportunity, in the lived experience of students, it's I can't afford to go to college, but I can't afford not to go to college because I'll end up in poverty. I think we really need to pay attention to the message that's been sent by our government and also by the businesses to whom our government often listens on these things. So our government and private business told us that there's a skills gap and that we need you to go to school. We need this for the competitiveness of our economy, but also it's going to benefit you. I think, it's interesting in that context that we didn't say we need this for our economy and therefore we'll pay for it. Instead, we said we need this for our economy and you ought to fund it yourself. It'll pay off down the line. So our research shows that this is wrong. Those credentials were not rewarded on the whole in the labor market, and the debt that students took on over time was not justified. So the question for me is, who should pay for this failed policy experiment? And I would argue that we all ought to pay for it because we all were complicit in creating it. And so I think we ought to look at solutions like student debt cancellation, which is mentioned in the keynote. And I also think it's key to point out that even in the context of free college and debt cancellation, we ought to be looking very seriously at regulating the student loan industry. We need to crack down on accountability within the federal student loan program, but also what sometimes gets left out of the conversation is the private student loan industry. So I think it was really heartening to see policymakers in the last couple of weeks focusing on bankruptcy. We need to look at bankruptcy and far beyond that to regulating even the new and upcoming subprime borrowing that we'll see in the income share agreement industry.
Great. And we will talk much more about solution strategies as we go forward too.
Good afternoon. So I would definitely start off by saying a 5. And part of how we got here as the Education Trust is we advocate for low-income students and students of color for educational opportunities across the pipeline from early education through higher ed. Traditionally, we hadn't been as focused on student debt besides our interest in consumer protections for students who attend for-profit colleges and universities, and the intersection between student debt and, of course, increasing completion overall in higher ed. But increasingly, as folks like Julie and others across the field, some of which are in this room, produced research that demonstrated that for the students we focus on, in particular, low-income students and students of color, there's a particular crisis that we couldn't ignore and wanted to make sure that all of our advocacy efforts were being used to help push solutions that would make a difference for these students. So for those reasons, I would say it's a 5. And to Julie's point, share in the thinking that if we're going to require post-secondary degree or credential for students to earn a livable wage, that degree or credential ought to be affordable. And that's why we're here today, because it's not. And so as it was alluded to earlier, you can no longer work your way through college. And in fact, a great illustration of this I found on a really important resource. If you aren't tapped in, make sure you're on Twitter, because on Twitter, the great Susan Donarski tweeted over the weekend, in 1968, you could earn a year of tuition at University of North Carolina by working 220 hours at minimum wage. But today, in 2019, it would take over 1,200 hours at minimum wage to be able to pay for that 1 year of tuition at the same institution, as a great illustration of it's no longer possible for you to work your way through college. And as a result, students are taking on debt to pay. And if students could afford this debt and repay it back with ease, we wouldn't be in this room today, but they aren't. 1 in 10 students end up defaulting on their student loans, and default is the most egregious situation, but we understand that those who are making payments every single month on time are still struggling. And so repayment rates tell us a little bit about what's happening there. And so about a third of students had not paid down at least $1 on their principal after 5 years. So this means they're making payments every month, allocating their resources, and not making any progress. And then again, this, of course, as we'll get into discussion today, has an impact on their entire life and all of the choices that they're able to make for themselves, for their children, et cetera. And I guess all of us why this room might be packed, is that we came in with this understanding that there is a student debt crisis. But what I hope you leave with is a clearer understanding that not all students experience this crisis in the same way. And so Julie did a great job bringing up the fact that Black borrowers in particular are experiencing this crisis in a specific way. Some of this has to do with some intersections of the completion crisis, students attending college and not completing, but then also where they attend. And so just one statistic that helps drive this home is 3 out of 4 Black students who attend for-profit colleges and universities that leave before earning their degree or credential end up defaulting on their student loans. And that's not just a problem at for-profit colleges, although it's most pronounced there. 2/3 of Black students who drop out of 4-year nonprofit graduate, public 4-year or private, end up defaulting on their student loans as well. So again, I hope that this helps to drive home that as we think about solutions, and I know we'll get into a rich discussion today, keep these racial disparities in mind, but not as a way to think about how to blame students for, not paying back their loans. It's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of systems at play that impact their ability to repay. So, for example, white families have 10 times the wealth on average as a black family. Also, the wage gap. So if students do graduate, earn their degree, get a job, do what they're supposed to do, black college graduates earn less on average than white adults who do not have a college degree. So these wage gaps impact the resources that they have to be able to repay their loans. So as we think through solutions, what makes sense, let's be thinking about those who are struggling the most to repay and think about how we got here and all of the discriminatory systems in education, in lending, housing, et cetera, that impact both the resources that they have as they attend college and figure out how to pay, and afterwards when they're figuring out how to repay their loans. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, it's great to be here. My name's Jeff Andrade. I work for the McKeon Group, which is founded by former chairman of the House Education and then Workforce Committee, Buck McKeon. Chairman McKeon's also co-chairing he's the Republican co-chair of BPC's Higher Education Task Force. And I guess first and foremost, my experience here is as a student loan survivor. And I think each generation thinks that they have it worse than others. And if we're going to be sort of, exchanging tales of, who's had it worse, I came in at it basically at an institution that costs more than our family income in 1 year. A situation where student tuition increases went up nearly 50% over the 4 years, and we did it at 9% interest rates, and we're the first to have loan origination fees. But I can tell you, despite all that, you can actually pay back your loans in full and not default. And I think part of what student loans get a bad rap. Student loans can be a very effective tool because what you are doing is you are essentially borrowing against future income, and I don't think we look at that enough. And you're borrowing against future income, and you're using it with tomorrow's dollars. So it's actually in some ways a better option than saving, almost a better option than working through. But there's a couple of caveats I think that you have to have when you're looking at this. And one is the key is to try to get through school as quickly as possible. Every month that a student stays in school from a living expense standpoint costs them an additional $2,000. You have the inflationary $2,000 a month. Excuse me. You have the inflationary impact of tuition prices keep going up each year, and then you also have lost income. For the average, graduate coming out at $48,000 a year, that's $4,000 a month, and then you have the effects of interest capitalization. And if you capitalize your interest while you're in school for 4 years, and you had the 6.8% loans, that's roughly going to add 18% to your balance. So there's a lot of factors, and we were actually pleased to see a number of changes in the Prosper Act that was introduced in the last Congress that pushed students to complete quicker. So in terms of a crisis, I would put it actually as a 2.5. I think for most students, they have interest rates and payments that are within generally acceptable limits. If you look at undergraduates, you're looking at roughly $30,000. That translates into about a $323 a month payment. The places where the two key places where I see stress in the system is the proliferation of graduate students and the amount of debt that they've incurred versus the return on investment that they're likely to get out of that education, and those who do not complete education, who I think are being pursued for loan amounts that are vastly greater than the market value of those loans if they were to be sold as outright debt.
All right, thank you. So I want to just dig in a little bit to what is the experience like of carrying these loans, trying to manage them, paying them off, navigating the 10 repayment plan options that federal borrowers have. So Julie, I'm going to throw that to you. And then Tiffany, if you could share a little bit more about how that managing the loans experience differs for lower income borrowers and borrowers of color.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it takes me back to a little bit of what Jeff said, which pushes one of my buttons. So let's talk about it. This idea of generally acceptable limits on how much money people take on. The data that we collect on student loans looks primarily at default and delinquency, and doesn't really look at the impact on borrowers who are successfully in repayment. We just don't have a lot there. So I can talk about the experience of struggling to repay. We have options available for students like income-based repayment. They're much harder to get into than they ought to be. They're easy to fall out of, right? So we're doing a much worse job than we ought to be doing for borrowers who actually cannot make their monthly payments. But even beyond that, for borrowers who are making their monthly payments, I think our data do them a tremendous disservice by looking at them as though they are just fine, when in fact, economic research out of the Federal Reserve, and then even the polling that came out in the last few weeks about Elizabeth Warren's student debt plan show that borrowers are struggling to do the things that we thought they were going to do when they got a college degree, to buy a home, to start a family, to save for retirement, to save for their kids to go to college. So it's much harder than it might appear on the surface, and I think we really need to give some serious attention to what this experience is like for borrowers.
And I would just add to that to say, those challenges, whether it be having additional resources to be able to buy a home and things that actually could help families accumulate wealth, are just more pronounced for, I talked about Black families in particular because they have so little wealth to begin with. And so, again, that there's challenges and competing priorities, whether it be around childcare, healthcare, decisions about whether or not they can earn an additional degree or credential that might help propel them in the job market as well. I think one thing to keep in mind is that over half of Black associate's degree recipients borrow. And so an associate's degree is not the degree that research suggests actually moves students the most in terms of social mobility. It's a bachelor's degree. So we'd assume that these students, if they want to get the most out of earning a post-secondary degree, would be able to afford a bachelor's degree. But again, students are already borrowing just to get the 2-year degree. So I think that's important context as well. And just thinking about the fact that they have less support in terms of being able to rely on family members to help them repay their loans. And so I spent a bit of time talking about this population of folks with some college, no degree. In fact, about a fifth of all adults have some sort of some college degree, some college credits, but no degree. And so there's been some discussion about how do you re-engage these folks in higher ed so they can come back, earn their degree, and have more success in the job market. And so just to highlight a kind of a promising way of thinking and some work that Wayne State University is doing in particular to try to re-engage some of these adults with some college, no degree, and their location in downtown Detroit being able to tap into the high population of low-income Black adults there. There's a commitment to forgive some of their loans and help them repay the loans that they have as part of the agreement for them to re-engage and re-enroll. In fact, they built it out so that it's incentivized around them persisting. So if they persist to the next semester, they'll get more debt forgiven, and then the next. And so I think these are promising models to figure out how to re-engage these folks, because otherwise they have these competing priorities where they are trying to figure out how to repay their loans and all of the other financial responsibilities that they have, when we know that them eventually eventually earning their post-secondary degree or credential is important. So the good news is that there are other universities specifically in that area who've jumped on board as well and hoping to expand that program. But I think ideas like that have to be a part of our thinking in terms of figuring out how to make sure that these folks that have some college and no degree are able to earn their degree so they can actually have a greater likelihood that they'll be able to repay their loans, because those without the college degree who dropped out default at almost twice the rate as those who actually complete their degree.
Can I
Quick jump.
what Tiffany was saying just inspired me to think about, I feel like I didn't fully answer your question on the borrowers who are struggling to repay and their options. I just want to talk about bankruptcy for one more minute. Despite the fact that on virtually every other type of expense, a person can file for bankruptcy and receive some protection from those debts, we have removed those protections not only for federal student loans, but also for private student loans. It's extremely difficult for a borrower to discharge their student loan in bankruptcy. There's even been some reports that on loans that ought to be discharged in bankruptcy, the lenders are hiding that fact from the borrowers. Just in terms of what that experience looks like for a borrower, we have reports of the Department of Education going through people's receipts showing, look, you spent money on fast food this month and therefore you ought to be able to repay your loan. We are making it, not only does the law make it unnecessarily hard, but the way that our government and the other lenders interpret the law and fight tooth and nail against people who very obviously can't repay their debts is, in my mind, unjust.
So, Jeff, looks like you may have a response there. Feel free to, but I also want to just pitch my next question, which is for you. You have deep expertise on the policymaking side, both on the Hill and working for the Department of Education. And from that different perspective and viewpoint, what are the pain points in the student loan disbursement and management systems that contribute to these problems or that contribute to other problems around the program?
Yeah, a lot of the problems that I see that we have now are stemming from the takeover 10 years ago of the student loan program by the federal government. So, for example, interest rates. Interest rates, there used to be price competition in the FEL program between lenders, and interest rates tend to be on the shorter end of the yield curve, meaning that historically they were lower. And so one of the constraints you have now in the current system is it would cost the federal government billions of dollars to lower interest rates below where they currently are. The other thing is I think, overuse and abuse of the income-based repayment options. Not only are they confusing for borrowers, and I confess, whenever I'm talking to borrowers, and I get usually pulled aside a lot whenever you tell people you work in the student loan area. They're always asking you for advice. But I always have to pull a cheat sheet to figure out all the myriad of options. And it's exceptionally confusing. But I think the big injustice of the current system right now is we've turned the federal government, we've turned the Department of Education to essentially a loan shark with income-based repayment. Because the pay down for those borrowers are doing what their government has asked them to do based, on legislation from the previous, pushed by the previous administration, and they're not making a dent in their loan balances. Every month their loan balances are going up and up and up. And it looks very similar to a credit card minimum payment without the Card Act disclosure. And I think, and we see more and more people on the left sort of pushing people into income-based repayment when probably the better option for them is to try to pay this down quickly. I think the other problem with IBR is that we're using it on primarily discretionary income, where we should be able to do it more on gross income, similar to what we do in underwriting standards for other loans. But I think the combination of those two factors, not being able to provide interest rate relief and having essentially predatory repayment plans against borrowers, is one of the problems that we're seeing, because this 1.5 trillion that we see reported on keeps going up a decimal point every couple months. And it's because people aren't paying down the balances as fast as they should.
quick response is yes, and then I do want to move into, as we have time, conversation about reform options.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I agree that I think there's are some problems with our reliance on income-based repayment as well. I think my sense is that the need for income-based repayment is a symptom of the larger problem, which is the failure of student loans as a policy for financing higher education. And so my problem with income-based repayment is essentially that instead of us taking care of this problem as a country, we're sort of like benevolently mitigating it by asking people to pay less of their income over a longer period of time. I think it's the wrong way to approach it. But the idea that we did this better under the FEL system or that private lenders do this better, I think just is not supported by the evidence.
Well, I would disagree because we didn't have a situation of negative amortization like we do now. And that is the big part of the problem. And in fact, the government has an incentive to keep people in longer. And if you look at these proposals, and one of the reasons why you have the 10-year rule, for example, was because it pushed the loan forgiveness out of the budget window when they were originally passing it.
What's the government's incentive?
We actually need to
okay.
move on to reform
Okay.
options, but
Yeah.
I believe it is around like earning more interest income over time if you're not forgiving it. So we have heard many, many great newsworthy and also wonky technical proposals around what to do here. A lot of them, it was really refreshing as a policy researcher to see an area with like broad bipartisan engagement these days. It does not happen as often as you might want, but doing something about income-driven repayment plans seems to be one of those areas. There's also, as we mentioned, proposals around dealing with interest rates and refinancing, canceling student loans, discharging student loans under specific circumstances, particularly around people who went to private colleges. So given all of those options, and I'd be remiss to say that outside on that table is an executive summary of a recent Aspen report on what many of those options look like, as well as some of our colleagues' work on that subject. What are some of these strategies that you think would best address the problems that we've identified as we've had this conversation?
I'll jump in there with a couple thoughts. I think one, I've talked quite a bit about the completion crisis and the relationship between those being able to complete and earn their degree having more success repaying their loans. And so I think it's important for the federal government to take a more substantial role in ensuring that students are having access to high quality degrees and increased likelihood that they'll complete. So one part of that is maintaining and strengthening existing provisions that are in place, like the 90-10 rule and gainful employment, which are designed to ensure that there's a better return on investment for students. But I think there's a lot more that can be done, and in building a comprehensive system that would hold campuses accountable, not just for completion rates, which would be a really important part, but also their commitment to enrolling low-income students and students of color as well. This system would also provide additional resources for the campuses that are committed to serving these students, like community colleges, like historically Black colleges and others that have been under-resourced over time, so that they can use these additional resources to implement strategies that evidence suggests actually support the likelihood that students will complete. And then also, after you've done that and given folks time, then enforcing meaningful consequences around whether or not that they've made improvement. But I think there has to be an active role for the federal government in improving completion in higher ed. But remembering completion doesn't solve it all, and that, Black students who complete their bachelor's degree struggle to repay even more so than white students who don't. And so if it's going to be a massive, debt cancellation or some other proposal, just keeping in mind when you're setting limits around who to target based on who you assume struggles the most to take into consideration wealth alongside income, because you might miss a lot of struggling Black borrowers who might be above the income threshold but have significantly less wealth. And then also considering the role of student debt in exploratory conversations that have been proposed around reparations, because the wealth gap is directly related to the legacy of slavery and racially discriminatory policies in education, housing, and private market lending, et cetera. So if we're going to have a commission, as some is proposed, around reparations, operations, talking about student debt cancellation as a vehicle should be a part of the conversation as well. And the last thing I'll say around solutions is the best thing we can do is increase need-based aid so that low-income students don't have to take on additional debt in the first place. So improving the Pell Grant, increasing the maximum award, at least doubling it so it covers at least half of the full cost of attendance at a public four-year college or university would be important. If you're talking about free college programs, make sure you're thinking about how to account for costs beyond tuition for low-income students so that they don't have to take on additional debt to cover the costs related to books, transportation, housing, et cetera, so that they can go to school full-time if they so choose, which, as panelist has already said, actually increases the likelihood that they'll complete. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. And I think it's interesting that, Tiffany brought up sort of two regulatory guardrails that are out there that only apply to a minority of the institutions and students. I think accountability needs to be across the board. The problem's not just in the for-profit sector. I know that the left likes to always continue to point to that, but we have millions of students in this country that are basically trapped as far as their only option and are being pushed by a lot of the Democratic proposals into publicly funded failure factories that have very low withdrawal, very low graduation rates, despite their low price tags, and there are billions of dollars being wasted in Pell Grant funds on students who have been admitted to institutions, maybe under open admissions policies, but haven't been given the support services or the aptitude testing to ensure that they have a good likelihood to succeed going in. And so I think if we were able to redirect Pell Grant funds to encourage completion and also to make them more meaningful in terms of reducing people's cost of attendance, particularly at private nonprofit institutions, we would be heading in a good direction in that way. Because I think right now we are wasting a lot of money on people who never complete, and we're also in many cases ruining the financial lives of people through loans as a result of their participation in the system.
We are going to transition to Q&A in just a moment, but Julie, I want to give you a chance for a last word as well.
Yeah, I think we need to think about the front end and the back end, what's going to happen for future students and what we want to do for students with existing debt. On the front end, I think we need to think big. In other spaces like the healthcare space, we talk a lot about what a public option looks like. In higher education, I think we need to take that seriously. We have public institutions, but we don't treat them as public institutions. We don't invest in them the way that we ought to. And we also don't think about, whether or not they actually are serving public purposes. So I think we need to really rethink both how we invest in those schools and also what we make of them. And then on the back end, I think, like I said earlier, I'm really pleased to see that we're having a serious debate about debt cancellation. As Tiffany said, there are a lot of different ways to think about how we target debt cancellation, but it's so important to coming up with a solution to the student debt crisis. And then moving forward, like I said, even in a world of free college, even in a world where we cancel existing debt, the student debt program will live on, as will the private industry, and so we really need to take regulating those seriously.
All right, thank you. I think it worked out pretty well for us to stand up and loudly ask our questions. We've got about 9 minutes for that, so let's make sure that they are questions, but I will call on you as you raise your hands. Over there, yes.
So to play off of Representative Shalala's suggestion of greater visibility, what if we included her part of telling students up front, this is what your student loan repayment will look like if you take this much money out. But also when they enter a school to say, here's the likelihood of finishing at this school within 100% of the time of the degree or 150%. So you have that probability of admission.
Mm-hmm.
And also what your expected income will be if you major in this major or if
Yeah, I think the problem in transparency are the numerous options that we currently have. So I think, if Congresswoman Shalala's bill were to become law, it would probably be about a 15-page disclosure with a whole bunch of different numbers and what-ifs. But I think we do need more transparency, and I'm someone who supports matching how much you borrow to the expected earnings. And I think you see, what you major in determines, your income more than your school. And so I think, people who are in engineering, STEM, they have the capacity to borrow more. People that are going into early childhood education, divinity studies, they're on the lower end. And I think that needs to be in mind. And I don't know if that's counseling. I know a lot of the schools that I would work with, would have concerns about possible, misrepresentation liability if they were to put that out. And they're very cagey about putting the statistics out. They'll point to you and they'll say statistics are here based on, with the Department of Labor, but they won't get into the specifics. But I think it's very important to match how much you borrow versus how much you can potentially earn.
Look, I think there's always more that people could know about their student loans, and the more complicated we make the program, the more there is to know, right? But this, it's kind of striking, I think, to be talking about consumer information now, because when Representative McKeon was, right, when we did the college, what was it called? The College Cost and Opportunity Act? Anyway, in 2007, there was a huge emphasis on consumer information. We tried to educate our way out of our country's affordability problem, and it didn't work. I think we ended up with 85 different watch lists for how expensive colleges were. These are the public ones that are the most expensive, and the private ones. It didn't make a difference for people who don't have the money to go to school. Telling them how much it's going to cost or how much one loan they might pay in interest is not going to make a big difference. So I think we should be wary of the idea that this is an individual problem that individual choices will solve. And we need to find bigger solutions.
And I would just add to that to keep in mind that most students don't have choice. They end up going to the college or university that's closest by that does not have selective admissions. But a full proponent of, providing the best information available and being transparent to students and families are really important. But just keeping in mind that most students don't have choices. And so the ideal situation is one in which those choices are affordable. It's probably the priority.
All right, other questions? Yep, in the back.
My name's John from the National Governors Association, and I'm wondering if you could each talk briefly about the role that you see federal state engagement playing.
I think two quick things. One, states provide money to institutions and they provide money to students through state financial aid programs, for example. And so rethinking, one, making sure that there's an emphasis on need-based aid. A lot of states give out money based on how they define merit, and they might define merit as standardized test scores, which are directly correlated with students' income. And so they, in turn, are giving out a lot of state dollars to help students pay for college who can already pay. So we would encourage states to think about how to redirect those funds so that they're more so based on need. And as they explore, many states, over 15 now, have some sort of free college promise program to be thoughtful about low-income students in particular, because they're making 2 years of community college free, but to be thinking about those costs beyond tuition for those students, because again, when they don't have those non-tuition costs covered, that's where they're borrowing. And the challenge we're seeing is that in some states, as they're spending more money on something like free college, which might provide some benefit to students who are upper income and can afford college tuition, they are not fully funding their need-based aid programs. So that means there's low-income students who are not getting what they need while states are spending money on upper-income students. So we would encourage states not to do that, to fully fund their need-based aid programs. And then when they're thinking about how they give out money to the institutions, they most often give the most money to colleges in their state that are more selective, that already have more resources that can be spent on helping students pay. So that means part of the reason that some of these colleges, like community colleges and open access four-year colleges, where they have higher, their completion rates are lower, part of the issue is that they have more low-income students and they have fewer resources to support those students, or to even give them, more resources to pay for college, much less the support services that they need. So states can do something about that. They can change how they give out those dollars so that they're not spending the most money on the colleges and universities that already have the most, that are also serving the students that have the most, if that makes sense.
I want to jump in on that too. A lot of what I'm seeing in terms of these federal-state partnerships is actually a very thinly veiled attempt to lock states into a federal maintenance of effort requirement for state spending. I think those on the left and people at the public institutions see sort of the demographic of the traditional traditional student population coming down the pike and see a dip, and they want to maintain their current levels of funding. So I think we already have federal-state partnerships in terms of it's a state responsibility to run community colleges and public universities, as well as need-based grant, and they layer that on top of a base of federal support. So I'm not sure, other than putting a maintenance of effort requirement, what you're really going to see come out of these federal-state partnership proposals.
I think we should be paying a lot of attention to federal-state partnerships. I think, when you look at the scale of the problem, and if you look at the goal of helping students in the U.S., regardless of which state they live in, we're going to need a federal investment here. I think it's fair to ask questions about what kinds of requirements we're going to put on states in those circumstances. But I think my fear is less that we're going to end up with just maintenance of effort, and more that we're going to end up with money going into states without real change for actual students. So it's a conversation that deserves a lot of attention.
Well, thank you all so much. Our next conversation in just a moment here is going to focus on, all right, we've got these 45 million borrowers out there today, but what about our next generation? Our conversation touched on that in a number of ways, and we're going to explore it much more deeply. As a closing word, I would say, as confusing as all of the options around repayment are, and as tough as it can be both as a government to administer and as a borrower to navigate, figuring out what to do is just as complicated a conversation, and I would really encourage you all to check out not just Aspen's work on that, but also everyone up here and those on the next panel who work on loans as well. Thank you so much.